All right, everyone should be able to see my screen. I'm going to do a quick welcome. So hopefully you're in the right place and you've come for the Aging on the Farm UMASH Community Forum. We'll be together for a couple of hours today. So just some housekeeping so that everyone knows how we're operating. If you have any questions that come up during the forum, please feel free to do a private chat to myself. So my name is Megan Shasso. We also have a technical expert online, and I believe I saw Vipalvi join, and so he can answer technical questions as well. We can answer emails if something comes up along the way as well, and our email is umash@umn.edu. We will be muting all of the participants until we get to the breakout rooms in which we'll all be able to talk with each other. So if I mute you, it's only so that we can keep the quality high for everybody online today. And we also have a moderated Q&A happening today, and the questions that you all submit will happen through that chat feature as well. And you should be able to see that on your screen. And if you have difficulties, please use these resources that I listed on here. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jeff Bender. He is the director of the Upper Midwest Agricultural Safety and Health Center, to kick us off.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you as well to our community forum on aging on the farm. You know, this idea came up really from an astute PhD student from North Dakota. She approached us and said, "Hey, I would like to do something regarding this topic. I'm an occupational therapy student, and you know, I'm worried about my farm family, and how do we actually support our farmers as they age?" And so they tend to be quite a resilient group, and maybe a little bit on the stubborn side. And so I'm sure that there was family discussions about, Dad, do you really need to be doing that anymore? Is part of the discussion. But that's actually how this forum began. And I don't know if I have control of the slides here. So Megan, I'll have you just flip through the next one here as to remind me what I needed to do. I'm excited today about our speakers. And one of the ideas that we really wanted to get across is trying to do some work regionally. How do we support this concept of aging on the farm, especially from a regional basis? And my hope at the time was to get out and personally travel to Western Wisconsin and to meet folks and try to actually help synergize and create some networks there. And unfortunately, the pandemic had other plans for us. And so we're having to do this virtually. And with that, though, we've got some exceptional speakers representing kind of the region and to really support that work. So actually, if you can go back up, Megan, there. So let me just talk to you a little bit about our UMASH, the Upper Midwest Agricultural Safety and Health Center. Our center really is focused on how do we support farmers, agriculture producers, workers, and their families to keep them healthy and safe. And you know, we are one of 11 centers, and actually we collaborate and work with a number of our other ag centers. Each of us has our own focus. Our particular focus is we tend to have our philosophy is that we have a One Health approach. We focus in on looking at the environment, animals, and humans, and how they interrelate, and how do we actually bring multiple disciplines to really bring together. And actually this forum is a good example of that, where we're bringing in disciplines that we traditionally don't work with and try to address the health and safety needs of our agricultural community. Next slide. Again, this is our mission to really minimize the burden of occupational diseases and injuries in agricultural workers and their families. We do that through a number of mechanisms. This outreach forum, this community forum is an example of that. Next slide. What I hope that you can walk away with today, at least my goals for myself is to really increase the awareness of the impact of aging and its health and safety implications for our rural communities, especially here in the upper Midwest. I also am curious to know what are the educational and outreach materials in the region. So one is to help identify what those materials are, and can we assemble them, and can we make them readily available to people that need to use them. The other is the importance of community engagement. And though we're doing this by Zoom, I'm hoping that we can start to create a community that actually is dealing with this issue and support that issue. And then lastly, what I'd like to do is make sure we can collect these resources, and actually, if we don't have them, to create them to support our rural communities. Next slide, Megan. And before I dive in there, Megan, I want to just make sure I haven't forgot anything. Let me check my notes here before I introduce Joe and kind of our program a little bit. Am I forgetting anything?
I don't think so. And we're actually going to kick off with Lisa today. Joe is still getting on. So
I'm actually on. Oh. Megan, I'm on and ready whenever you
Perfect.
Yeah.
We have Joe on and ready. So I will let Jeff introduce Joe, and then we'll dive into it. But we have not missed anything so far.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, this just goes to the show when the show is on the road like this, we never know what to expect. I had problems just even getting on myself. So, but I think we do have an exceptional program with varied speakers representing basically our community and a number that really focus and work in this particular area. I have the pleasure to introduce our first speaker, whose title for his presentation today is Challenges and Opportunities of Aging in Rural Communities. Joe Gaugler is actually a Robert L. Kane Endowed Chair in Long-Term Care and Aging, and directs the School of Public Health Center for Aging. And so he brings an incredible wealth of knowledge. He's an applied gerontologist focusing in on Alzheimer's disease and long-term care. He's interested in long-term care impacts on their families and the effectiveness of community-based and psychosocial services, especially for older adults and their caregivers. So really a focus on dementia. Joe, I'm gonna stop here and quit blabbing and let you take over. I look forward to your talks. We have 3 talks that we've got scheduled, and a special guest speaker from Robert Kohler, who was one of our key partners when we were going to do this on his farm. And so with that, I will turn it over to Joe and let you begin our session today. Thanks.
Well, great, Jeff. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to be co-sponsoring this event. The Center for Healthy Aging and Innovation is very excited to do so in partnership with UMASH. Great to see so many people attending here via Zoom. I see a lot of familiar names on the list. And so again, thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. So I'm going to share my screen here. We'll get started. Looks like that's coming through okay, which is great. So it was interesting pulling this together. As Dr. Bender had shared with you, I am a researcher who's long been interested in dementia care and dementia care innovations, and not only doing that from a research standpoint, but then also from a community engagement and education perspective as well. I am not a rural expert. I am not an expert in rural aging per se, so this was a little bit of a learning experience for me. Forgive me if you feel some of the information I'm providing is rudimentary or maybe is not extensive enough to your liking. But that being said, it was certainly an interesting learning experience for me to think more about what are some of the challenges of aging, not only on the farm, but in rural communities as well. And not only just focusing on challenges, but opportunities too. And if time permits, I'm hoping we're going to have some dedicated space to really think about that. Too often when we work in spaces with quote unquote underserved communities, we focus so much on the challenges and we don't always necessarily see the resources. What do these communities actually bring to the table, and how can we build around that when we think of improving the aging experience, or more specifically improving long-term care for said communities? So really there are 3 points here in the presentation. What does aging in rural areas and communities in the US look like right now? I mean, what are we seeing? Be interesting to hear from your perspectives too, whether it's after this talk or more specifically during the breakout sessions. How does this reflect your own experiences or the experiences of people you know or work with? As mentioned, we'll talk about challenges and concerns, but perhaps as importantly, what are the solutions? Are the solutions already out there and we just don't know about them? We're not promoting them enough? Are there ways to highlight some of the great work many of you are doing? And more specifically, where else do we have to go to continue to move forward and advance the quality of aging in rural communities? So, there's some statistics, which again, these are numbers. And so numbers might not always have a lot of meaning, but I think when I contemplated this a little bit in pulling these slides together, I think these are important statistics to highlight. So roughly 20% of all older Americans, those 65 and over, do live in rural areas in the US. When you compare the percentage or proportion of the aging population across urban and rural areas, you can see almost 5% higher percentage of the rural population is older than it was in urban areas. Now, perhaps this isn't too surprising, but nonetheless, you definitely see a particular contrast there. Hopefully you can see this, but this was a really interesting graphic that the Census Bureau had put up a couple years, actually last year. This is from a longitudinal study of aging in rural and other geographic areas. And you can kind of see here yourself. The nice thing about this report is they didn't just simply look at metropolitan and non-metropolitan areas. They actually used a gradient to characterize the rurality of the counties studied. And what you can see here is counties that are more rural on this gradient, you see a greater concentration of older persons. And I particularly point you to the one on the bottom, and focusing in our area of the country, the upper Midwest, where you can see in counties that tend to be more rural, you see that there's a considerably higher cluster proportion of people older in those particular counties. So the aging of rural America, I think, is particularly salient for the upper Midwest. This is another interesting graphic here I wanted to highlight to you, which gives you a sense of the percentage of the population 65 years and over in rural and urban areas by state. So, you can start with Vermont, which is an interesting, almost an outlier, where really in the population, I hope I'm interpreting this the right way, in rural areas, or basically of the entire aging population, 2/3 of it live in rural areas in Vermont, which, again, I think is a stark contrast to urban areas. When you look at Minnesota and Wisconsin, more in the middle here, you can see roughly 1/3 of the aging population in both states live in rural areas. So again, a fair amount of concentration of older persons in rural areas in our states. Again, this may not be new to you, but I always think it's interesting to look at this and look at the graphical illustration of these data to give us a sense of, what are the demographics of aging looking like in the state of Minnesota, Wisconsin, the upper Midwest, and the nation in general. So a couple of other interesting statistics that came out of this recent report. There were more older men than older women in rural areas, which is in contrast to when you look at aging in general. Why is this? And I think we'll hear more about this from our other speakers as well as in the breakout sessions. This may very well be to the likely due to aging in place, for example, because of farming, mining, or other types of industries that tend to employ men more commonly than women per se, but it also may be due to potential migration patterns as well, particularly in, say, Sunbelt states or other warmer climate states. Most, actually more than 3/4 of older persons in rural areas do live with somebody, compared to a little less than 70% for those who live in rural areas. I might have put the statistic inappropriately, but essentially there are fewer older persons who live alone in urban areas, even though I accidentally put the same percentage here. It's roughly around 22% of older people in urban areas live alone versus 28% of those in rural areas. Finally, an interesting statistic. Now, this may be good or bad depending on your perspective, but only 1% of older persons in rural areas live in nursing homes compared to 3% in urban. Now, again, these are fairly small percentages. Given the challenges of COVID as a public health concern, you could make the argument that in fact it might be better for older people to be living at home versus in an institutional setting. That being said, it could also reflect potential lack of capacity, basically older persons being underserved who might very well need residential long-term care services, but it's simply not available in the rural areas. So again, statistics are to statistics. I mean, there's a lot more that goes into actually interpreting these findings, but these are just some of the things that jump out at me when considering aging in rural areas in the US. So why, and again, I'm putting these in quotes. I took this directly from this reading because I think some of it demands some additional analysis and thought. Again, this was from a summit in 2017 that was looking at connectivity or internet issues amongst aging communities. And they provided a bunch of reasons why there are certain challenges in rural communities, particularly for older persons living in rural communities. By and large, older persons who live in rural communities are more likely to have chronic diseases and several other negative health indicators. And there might be a number of contextual reasons as to why these rural communities are challenged. And you see a whole list of them here. I won't go through each one. I mean, there's economic challenges, an aging housing stock, certainly the opioid crisis, which has influenced older persons vis-a-vis caregiving responsibilities, grandparents raising grandchildren, for example, lack of resources, out-migration of younger persons, et cetera. This difficulty of forming community partnerships because of proximity challenges. So I'm going to stop there. You know, I mean, we can go ad nauseum and just list out all of these challenges that rural communities have, but I also reflect back a little bit to some of my own research that I did and also in working with colleagues who had done work, particularly in nursing homes in rural areas. And one of the things they noted to me, and it's always made an impression on me when I think of, you know, working with providers and families and older persons. And it was this, is, you know, when you go to a rural community and say visit a nursing home, there are no doubt challenges that that nursing home might have environmentally, resource-wise, in contrast to maybe certain urban communities. Not all, but certain urban or suburban areas. For example, the nursing home setting might not be brand new. It may very well be the old community hospital that's been converted into a nursing home. There might be other issues in terms of the resources available financially to that nursing home, staffing issues, which we'll talk about, et cetera. But then there's a flip side to this too that I found is, granted, it might not look the best all of the time, but when you visit some of these nursing homes and in working with families and older persons, one thing that always struck me is a lot of the times the staff in those places, they knew the residents they were caring for. They grew up with the families of the residents they were caring for. And that oftentimes led to a different type of care, a different type of relationship that would be forged between residents and staff. The reason why I want to bring this up as a contrast is we always have to look beyond simple listing of challenges and issues and problems, and also think about what are some of the unique resources some of these rural communities may bring to the table, and how do we build out on those if we're trying to solve and address some of these challenges. So what are some of these more specific challenges, but more importantly, are there some solutions on the table? So I listed out a few here. These are by no means universal or all-encompassing. I don't have the time to do that, but some that jumped out at me that I thought were interesting to contemplate. One are persistent provider shortages. The number of physicians for every 10,000 people is approximately 30% lower in rural communities. Similar difference when you look at specialty care like geriatrics or geriatricians per se. Where in rural areas there are few geriatricians to go around for older persons in need. So what are the solutions to this? How can we address this? One of the potential solutions is to empower other types of care providers to offer coordinated primary care. One example, for example, are nurses. Nurse care coordinators, particularly potentially nurses who are being trained and given doctorates in nursing practice, for example. Can they fill the gaps in primary care that are often apparent in these rural areas? And has any progress been made? I know in Minnesota, you know, there was a lot of advocacy to try to allow DNPs to be able to practice individually and not have to have kind of a physician oversight or physician overseer. That law was passed. Has that actually influenced the access to primary care in rural areas to this point? I don't know. Maybe it hasn't. But nonetheless, thinking about other types of professions that can offer some degree of primary care and empowering them to fill these gaps might be an important potential solution. One that comes up constantly across this literature, even for someone who's not as steeped in this literature, are the challenges of transportation. Geographic distance in particular, being able to travel to social engagements, being able to easily travel to hospitals or specialty care, which often might require long distances to do so. This has been compounded by the fact that many rural hospitals have been closing. And what has that done overall to accessibility in the care offered and available to older persons and their families in these rural areas? You know, this summit that I referred to earlier, the Scofilos et al. Paper, did spend some time thinking through, are there other kind of opportunities to offset the problems in obtaining transportation? You know, and they listed some things like volunteer organizations to even trying to work more closely with ride-sharing companies where billing actually would go to, like, say, the VA or some other payer versus the person individually. I mean, these are just ideas. Again, whether these are solutions, it's unknown. But one thing that's clear is to address some of these intractable problems, it may be needing to think outside the box to some extent. Another is an aging workforce. In this Jaffe paper, you know, it was an interesting paper in that Jaffe interviewed providers in rural areas as well as some nursing home staff too. And she had mentioned in one interview she did with a staff, I think a director in a North Dakota nursing home, the majority of their staff were in the 70s and 80s. I mean, to wrap your head around that and to consider that when we think of aging in rural communities, it's not just aging persons. For example, the topic of this forum, aging on the farm, it's also an aging workforce. How do we offset that and how do we address that? You know, some of the solutions aren't positive ones if you're an advocate for aging in place, which is essentially, you know, is aging in place really going to be possible for older people who are going to require or do require some type of residential long-term care? Can they receive it while they're still living at home? If they need nursing home care, it may be, unfortunately, the solution is people can't necessarily live at home anymore, even though they would want to. Those of us who advocate for, you know, more expansive community-based supports would argue strongly that aging in place should be maintained in any way possible. And maybe there does need to be exploration of alternative community-based or even residential strategies that, again, could maybe capitalize on some rural communities and can offset the need for more formal residential long-term care when it's no longer existent or might not necessarily be sustainable in the next 10, 15, 20 years. I'll leave you with this point here is when it comes down to it, I think, and a colleague of mine, Carrie Henning-Smith, who's the Associate Director of the Rural Health Research Center in the School of Public Health, she and her colleague, Ms. Lahr, provided a chapter to a book of mine that's coming out on rural caregiving. And one point she made in the chapter that I think is really important for us to deliberate and think about is, you know, we may sometimes have this tendency to focus on aging issues in silo, basically as a singular issue, when in fact, in order to address issues that pertain to quality of life and aging, being able to age in place for older persons in rural areas, it's going to require a much more global policy strategy. And I use broadband as a solution. You know, in reading through some of the articles for solutions for older persons, for example, doctor's visits and transportation, et cetera, the one solution that's thrown out a lot, particularly by those who are more interested in technology, is the issue of telehealth, you know, virtual visits, et cetera. This is simply not possible if we don't have a dedicated broadband infrastructure for rural communities. To the extent that costs have to come down to the degree where older persons in these rural communities would be comfortable and willing to utilize these types of solutions. It's probably going to take a concentrated, if not federal, policy solution to achieve that. Whether that's forthcoming or not is an entirely different issue. I won't go into that per se, but again, it's this issue of, if we indeed want to solve some of these challenges posed to rural aging communities, it's going to necessitate attacking them not just with older persons in mind, but with the entire community in mind. And broadband, I think, is a perfect example of that. I'm going to close with just some interesting resources I found that some of you might be interested as well. You might be familiar with these, but I thought they were really good. One is this Rural Health Information Hub, and in particular, they have a really cool toolkit they've developed on introduction to aging in place. And this is designed specifically for rural communities. Big emphasis here on age-friendly communities and how to achieve it. They also have a number of program resources to consider, a program clearinghouse, which I really like. A lot of really cool things on here. So those of you who are working with older persons in rural communities, you may want to check this out. The other one I thought was really interesting was Purdue has put together a rural caregivers website. A lot of resources specifically for caregivers. I'm presenting this because I'm interested in supporting families and family caregivers. And again, a lot of good resources on this particular page. I leave these are on my slides. So again, if these slides will be shared, Megan, I hope they are with the attendees, you can check those out yourself. So again, if you ever have questions related to aging, if you'd like to learn more about what our Center for Healthy Aging and Innovation is planning to do related to community outreach, for example, we hold a yearly conference called Caring for a Person with Memory Loss Conference. I invited many of you who have attended that conference to attend this forum, and hopefully you are here today. But again, we have a lot of activities where we work directly with communities, and we'd love to hear from you, and we can share more about that with you. So I'll stop there. Megan, Jeff, I don't know if there was anything else, or we just go to the next speaker here.
No, that was great.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you, Joe. We will introduce our next speaker,
Okay.
and then we will be taking questions for everybody following that. So up next, we have Lisa, and I'm going to let Jeff introduce her.
Great. Lisa has been one of our long-term key partners for UMASH, so it's a real pleasure to introduce Dr. Schiller. She's an associate professor and graduate programs director at UW-Eau Claire, and she's been with the university since 2009. She's a family nurse practitioner and has been practicing in rural Wisconsin for 23 years. That's dating you a little bit. We probably shouldn't put that info in there for you. Sorry about that. She's also a graduate from UW-Milwaukee and has a certificate in agricultural health and safety from the University of Iowa. And she's been a strong advocate, especially for the dairy community in Western Wisconsin. And with that, Lisa, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Let me just share my screen here, make sure I'm doing this right. Great. Can everybody see my screen?
It looks good.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about aging safely and productively and kind of what things you need to know. So this is kind of what I do at University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. I've been for almost 10 years now, been taking senior nursing students out to do health and safety education and screening on large dairies. We go to about 18 large dairies. We see farm owners and their families as well as farm workers. So I've had over 100 students go through this program. I take about 6 to 8 students at a time. We have a couple of interpreters that come with us, as well as a public health nurse, either from Pepin or Buffalo County, which are the 2 counties that we go to. And we go ahead and do cholesterol screening, TB screening. When we look at who we've seen, we have seen the age of farmers actually go up within our group. So if we look at the Hispanic workers that we see, their average age is about 30 plus, and that's about 80% of whom we see. And then of the farm owners, it's about 49 plus, which is pretty consistent. And then this is just another picture of kind of our makeshift clinics that we do. We often are in milk house offices or other places on the farm. And this picture here I put in because this is one of the real reasons why I'm interested in aging on the farm. This is my husband's family, who we live near our farm where they've been farming for 150 years. That handsome man in there is Otis Fossum, who just passed this last year. And I have had the pleasure of having coffee in this office room here almost every morning with these fine folks and helping them through the changes that they've had in the farm. So these are just some facts. So the average age of farmer has increased with every census, and I'm sure we'll see this on our new census. So in 1945, the average age of a farmer was 39 years. That's very different than the 58 years that it is now. And we all know with farming, farmers don't retire. They just work a little bit less and supervise more. They kind of, to be farming is to be active, and that's what keeps them young. I've had my share of scares with my uncles, watching them drive skid steers and stuff when I know they probably shouldn't be, but that's the way it goes. So the thing about farming is that there is a high risk of injury, and particularly fatal injury. And that risk goes up with age. So less than 55, we're looking at 18 to 20 per 100,000 fatalities. When you get over 55, that goes to 45 to 55,000 per 1,000 persons. So the highest age risk is 65 to 84. And when you think about this, you think of the average age of other workers in other industry, they're not working at 65 to 84, but farmers still are. Looking at non-fatal injury, falls account for a lot more of those injuries. So when we look at fatalities, it's really tractor injuries and falls. And when we look at non-fatal injury, it's really those falls that are of concern. And if you look at 18 to 21% versus 5% in all other workers, there's a difference. And if you look across industry too, if you take the average age of workers, farmers are about 16 years older than other workers. So the other thing that we need to consider in older farmers is the use of prescription medication. And we all know that as we age, we tend to have more chronic illness, so more hypertension, more higher cholesterol, and so we are on prescription medications. And this was a study that was done that shows that actually the odds ratio for farmers who are on medication was significantly higher, like 2.8-fold more for those that were on prescription medications. And these include all prescription medications. So it's not just pain medication or opioids, although that is a possibility. It is other medications for different chronic health problems. So what other things add to the risk of injury in this age group? Well, just the things that are associated with the type of work that farming is. So osteoarthritis is very common, particularly osteoarthritis of the knee and hip. And this then can kind of add into an increased risk for falls, which we know is a problem. The other thing is other issues related to exposure. So hearing loss, respiratory problems related to lack of PPE. And one thing that we can't forget is that depression is very common in older individuals. And it's estimated that it's close to 20% of the population over 65. And if you add to that a rural home, where there's less access to behavioral health services, it can be significant. So we need to keep that in mind. The other thing that's important to note is that farmers' self-perceived risk does not equal their actual risk. And I prefer to call this like the normalization of risk. And I remember having many, many conversations with Uncle Peter and Uncle Otis, and they would tell these stories of their near misses, I'm sure everybody's heard the near miss story. Oh, remember that time when the 2x4s almost fell on the, you know, and they would always end it, well, yep, farming's risky, you know, so it was just like an acceptance of risk. And so I think we need to be aware of that and intervene related to that. The other thing that I think is important here is the definition of health. So I put up here the World Health Organization definition of health, which is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, but not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So this makes sense to me as a nurse, but if you ask a farmer what it means to be healthy, there in fact was a study that Dr. Deborah Reed did, and what do you think was the most important thing? The ability to work. So if I'm able to work, that's how health is defined. So it's important to remember that as we're working with farmers, and I think, you know, as healthcare providers, when I think about working in primary care, and I'd have a farmer come in with a shoulder injury or back injury, and I would say, now no lifting more than 5 pounds for the next week, and need to be off of work. Those just aren't real possibilities. And so need to have workarounds related to that. So what are some things that we can do to help? So things that we need to put in place. So probably one of the biggest things is to practice prevention. So this means using personal protective equipment for hearing, respiratory, sun, chemical protection. The other thing that's important is to make sure that regular health care is being received. So now with Medicare, there are annual physical exams that are covered, and encourage individuals to participate in that, as well as have appropriate screenings, such as screening for depression, screening for diabetes, screening for high cholesterol. And of course, good nutrition and exercise is important. And Dr. Beltz will be talking a little bit more about some particulars with exercise, especially when you're thinking about falls and preventing falls. It's so important to keep up strength and balance and those kind of things. I think as farmers get older, or I know as farmers get older, they tend to do more of the tractor driving and some of those things that don't require as much physical labor, and that really can affect their balance and strength abilities. Making sure that individuals get rest periods. So it's okay to work, but you need to have rest periods too. The other thing to think about is making sure that there's protection in place to avoid falling. So making sure there's handrails, making sure there's good lighting, making sure there's proper footwear, and removal of hazards, because those trips and falls can be significant. If an older farmer trips and falls and breaks a hip, it can be quite consequences with that. Think about moderation of alcohol. And another thing that we really need to think about is ensure social connections. So these are really important, and I think in my family, that was extremely important with our daily coffee visits. Faith-based connections can be very important in rural communities too, and especially when we look at incidents of depression in this age group, it's important to keep those up. The other thing is, since most of the fatalities are related to tractors, important to install ROPS and seatbelts. So the next slide, I believe I just have a link to ROPS programs in Wisconsin and Minnesota. And these are my references. And this is my contact information. Please note, if you email me, I have the silliest email ever in that I have 3 L's in my email. And so if you put only 2, it won't come to me. So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. All right, well, I am going to pull up our next presenter and let Jeff introduce Dr. Beltz.
Great. Thanks again, Lisa. That was great to get your perspective and a little bit of your personal story there. That's great. Nick Beltz, Dr. Nick Beltz is actually the director of community fitness program. Actually, I'm really excited to bring him in. Again, it's another example of trying to bring in varying disciplines to try to deal with kind of the myriad of problems. So instead of a siloed approach, as Joe mentioned, but basically a more broader approach. So I'm excited to introduce Dr. Beltz. Dr. Beltz is currently a faculty member in the Department of Kinesiology at UW-Eau Claire. He teaches exercise physiology and community fitness program. And alongside his teaching responsibility, again, he serves as the director for the exercise physiology laboratory and the director of the community fitness program. I'm excited to have you. I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Beltz.
All right, I'm excited to be here. Thanks so much. This is great. Let's get some screen sharing here. Are your pictures showing up?
They are.
Okay. All right, perfect. So again, thanks for having me. By training, I'm a clinical exercise physiologist, so I get really geeked up and nerdy about physiology. So what we're doing today is we're gonna hit some aging physiology, some very general aging physiology. And if you see me bouncing around here, it's because I'm in my office on my exercise ball. I got an 8-month-old at home, so I'm trying to keep the back and the core strong, of course, from carrying around this little baby who is now teething and not sleeping. So also sleep deprived today. Originally, I'm from the Twin Cities, so I didn't have any experience really being around the farm until I got married a few years ago, and I married into a farming family. Between here and La Crosse, they owned a pretty prominent dairy farm in the town of Hague, Wisconsin, which is about 30 people just outside of Blair, Wisconsin. And being on the farm and realizing that there's a lot of connection between my expertise and my experience and working with aging populations, specifically farmers, because pretty prevalent in Western Wisconsin. So definitely thanks for having me. Very excited. Well, let's see if we can get a laser pointer here. Wonderful. Okay, so basically we're going to first talk about aging, maybe some just general epidemiological things about aging in the US. We've already heard some really great facts about aging, and there's a general picture that we're trying to paint here. And we'll talk about some changes that happen due to simply the aging process. And we kind of have to think at the same time, is it aging alone? Is it aging in combination with changes in behaviors over the course of a lifetime? And I'm sure we've all realized by now, it's a very complex interaction of a lot of things going on here, right? And we'll talk about something specifically called sarcopenia. So I always tell my students, we learn big fancy words every day. Like stegosaurus is a big fancy word. This is our stegosaurus word for the day. That's sarcopenia. And you can impress a bunch of people with the word sarcopenia after you leave here. Talk about some factors relating to sarcopenia and how it is a functional disability. And then finally, the resolution to a lot of this. And the resolution that I've seen and experienced through my master's and through my undergrad here, now working here, has been community outreach programs. There are 2 pretty prominent ones in Western Wisconsin alone, here at UW-Eau Claire and at UW-La Crosse. So those are options. However, I wish that there were quite a few more options. So we'll talk about that and then some just general wrap up. So in terms of the general demographic here of the aging population, you know, it turns out that of any age group, older adults over the age of 65 are the least physically active of any age group, right? So only about 30%, and this is probably over-reporting, of course, through surveys, but only about 30 to 32% report, they report no leisure time physical activity. So a third of all people over the age of 65 have no leisure time physical activity. It's probably probably quite a bit higher than that if you think about it. So that's outside of your work. And I realize this is where things get hairy because you're moving around and working out all day, right? But you know, a third of individuals don't get any exercise actually outside of their jobs. And it turns out that the aging population account for a majority of healthcare costs, right? They're the most rapidly growing age groups, and this is going to accelerate over the next 15 to 25 years. And because in about 2011, a lot of baby boomers started hitting 65, and they will continue to hit 65 through that generation. Now, this next figure is one of my favorite. If you look here, this is the changing of population distribution by age. So in the Depression, there's kind of a baby bust of not a lot of young kids, but then soldiers coming back from war with a baby boom here. We see this incredible tsunami of kids being born and then progressing through age ranges through the 80s, through the 90s, and then into the 2000s. So what we are doing is essentially as a population, and this is true for urban, this is extremely true for rural, as we've seen the stats, that we are getting older. And that is the main picture here. We're getting older as a population. We're getting older as a rural population. And that's not a bad thing, but things change. Things need to be adapted as we get older and older and older in our population. So there's a lot of things that happen physiologically when we age, right? We have changes in our heart and our blood vessel health, cardiovascular wise. We have changes to our lung structure and function, respiratory wise. I'm going to hit on just three very light topics with this, and that's your overall metabolic function. So basically how your body breaks down and stores food and calories that you eat. The overall integrity or quality of the muscle that you have. Of course, we are upright bipedal creatures. We are built to move. We have all these muscles that connect to all these bones via tendons. So we are built to move. We're built to move in a three-dimensional way. And if muscle integrity and quality changes, that's going to impact how we move throughout our environment. There are changes in bone mass, and there are changes to environmental stress as well, which in our area is very relevant with the extreme heat and the extreme cold. So what do we really call healthy aging? And I think healthy aging is trying to develop and maintain kind of three different things. You're trying to develop and maintain your mental health, right? Some social health, which is extremely important, as Lisa was kind of talking about, and then our overall physical well-being and function. And if we combine all these three, that's what we're talking about is optimal healthy aging. But if we have detriments in one of these, what we have to realize is even having detriments in your physical well-being will impact your social and your mental health. So it's not just as simple as just addressing physical health, because that's kind of what we're talking about with this presentation, but it's all the above. So specifically with aging and metabolic function, we talk about the most prevalent metabolic disease, and that would be diabetes, okay? Most diabetes, 95% of all diabetes cases is type 2 diabetes, right? So what was previously called adult onset diabetes. And this is a metabolic disorder. What we see is it is a disorder or a disease of aging, or the aging process. So 20 to 44 years old, not a lot of percentage of the population has diabetes, but all of a sudden, as we move through middle adulthood, we have a huge explosion in the prevalence of diabetes, both physician diagnosed and undiagnosed, which is pretty incredible, of course. You have to have blood tests to confirm diabetes over multiple visits. So a lot of people walk around without even knowing that they have diabetes, or they might have pre-diabetes, which will put them at a much greater risk for developing type 2 diabetes. And then by the time we get 65 years and older, I mean, a quarter to a third of the population actually has type 2 diabetes. So there's interesting things that happen where about near the age of 40, where this starts to explode exponentially, glucose tolerance actually decreases. So your ability to, with the foods that you eat, we don't store it as efficiently. We don't store the sugar as efficiently as we would normally do. And having this dysregulation of storing blood sugar, using blood sugar, storing in your muscles as glycogen, that really changes about then. And I think it's really connected with changes in LBM, which is lean body mass. So about the age of 40 to 45 is where we really start to see, you know, you're pretty solid with your body mass through up to about age 30. In other words, you're not just kind of wasting away with your muscle mass until then, but through your 30s and then specifically into your 40s, if you're not using it, you are really losing it in the decades after your 40s. And then it actually drops off even more after your 60s or 70s. So when we talk about exercise, that's why mine is specifically designed to talk about resistance training, because we hear a lot about aerobic training, cardiovascular training, going for walks, bike rides, ellipticals, you know, whatever really suits your fancy there. But resistance training is kind of the forgotten one here, and that's how we maintain our lean body mass. We talk about muscle integrity. We have two pictures here of a thigh muscle. One is here in the 25-year-old male, and then one might be representative of maybe an 80-year-old male here. So if we look at the white area here, well, this is your bone. The gray area is actually your muscle mass, and the black is your fat mass. So we can see kind of the natural changes that might happen over 50 to 60 years of life. The natural changes that might happen is these changes to muscle integrity. Now, I think if I was moving efficiently and trying to stay away from a disability model, I'd much rather favor to have maybe a thigh muscle that looks like this compared to something that looks like this, not super functional, right? We also have changes in bone mass as we age. So overall, we can see that osteoporosis and movement does impact bone health. So it's osteoporosis or osteopenia, low bone mass. We typically think of this as a female issue, not a female issue at all. We see that something like 70% of individuals 80 and over will have low bone mass or osteoporosis, and it's dang near 100% of a female over the age of 80. But we see as we age, the prevalence of low bone mass does change. And this is all about using those muscles, right? And keeping healthy bone mass. And if we have low bone mass or osteoporosis, we talk about being susceptible to things like fractures and falls. Okay. Beyond chronic disease, right, we have diminished quality of life, we have loss of independence. It's reflected by disability model increasing over the course of time. When you lose independence, when you're losing quality of life, we're talking about things that are really taking a hit, like your ability to perform instrumental activities like shopping, manage money, preparing meals. These are things that I see quite a bit in my own family or individuals that I work with in the aging population. And then of course, the more obvious ones, like your activities of daily living, like getting dressed, using the toilet, putting on shirts, combing your hair, things like that also change over the course of time. It can of course narrow the world, restrict an individual's engagement, overall enjoyment of life. So it does extend well beyond this chronic disease idea. So what is sarcopenia? I mean, literally we're talking about the poverty of flesh, okay? This is that natural loss of muscle mass and then the accompanying strength and functional changes that happen as you age. Now, it's primarily the result of changing a neurological stimuli. And if you're talking about diminishing neurological stimuli, well, that's just like a fancy word of saying you're not using your muscles. You're not using your muscles, so you're not activating those nerves that control the muscles, right? We also have changes in our hormones, and we have changes in our physical activity that basically compound or exacerbate this loss of muscle mass. So we have overall changes in our muscle architecture, right? We actually lose myocytes or muscle cells. So the cells that make up the muscle or the protein content actually decrease. Okay, so the quality changes. Now, this is not a quality muscle from a movement standpoint. You'd pay a lot of money for a steak that looks like this, but this type of muscle isn't exactly helping you move around the farm or do your job or do these activities of daily living effectively and safely. Okay, we have fatty infiltration, which overall changes the amount of muscle mass that we have, and it impacts the way that our muscle can actually synchronously fire, and we're talking about the endurance that our muscle has, the power that our muscle has, and this is all related to strength, power, balance, and everything like that. And along with this, we actually have diminished neural changes. So these nerves that actually control the muscles, we have huge changes with the nerves as well. Now, the good news behind all this is we look at like a 40-year-old triathlete compared to a 70-year-old triathlete and a 70-year-old sedentary man. Can it be preserved with correct intervention? Absolutely, and that's kind of the promising thing in all this. Now we have physical activity is a huge role, right? The big thing here is as we move less, we get losses in muscle mass. I mean, 22% of adults, only 22% engage in regular physical activity, okay? And it's even less with resistance exercise. It's only about 14 to 16% of older adults engage in physical activity through resistance training. So as we age, we have sarcopenia, right? We have the loss of muscle mass. So we kind of have a decrease in physical activity as a consequence, negative feedback loop of that. So we're burning less calories. So if you're eating the same amount of calories and you're burning less calories, you're probably going to gain unhealthy amounts of weight. We have an increased risk of overall disability. We have an increased risk of falls and fall injury. We have increased perception of effort with activities of daily living, which is huge, and we have an increased risk of chronic disease. So why is it important that we have an increased perception of effort? Because there's this idea of functional reserve capacity, and this is the easiest way to look at it. So you have this overall maximum amount of function in your physiological prime, that's 30 years old. Then as you age, you kind of lose that function as we see here. So you're moving optimally, performing optimally at 100% in your prime. Well, if we think of something like walking 4 miles per hour, that doesn't take up much of your functional reserve capacity, as we like to say. So walking 4 miles per hour when you're 30, I mean, that's like, easy peasy. But all these things that change over the cardiovascular, pulmonary, metabolic systems, bone health, muscle health, everything like that, that 4 miles per hour when you're 50, it now takes up a much greater percentage of your functional reserve capacity. So 4 miles per hour when you're 50 is kind of like a jog type of effort when you're 30. And 4 miles per hour walking when you're 70 takes up a lot of your functional reserve capacity. So now we're really talking about walking at 4 miles per hour when you're 70 might be like a dang near sprint when you're 30 years old. So if you're not doing things, they're going to be perceived as having much more effort, like on a rating of perceived exertion scale. Therefore, you're not going to do it as much. And if you don't do it as much, your reserve capacity is going to decrease. And it's all about changing. You can see these two individuals. One may have been exercising or doing resistance training their whole life. The other one may have not. These people live to the exact same age, but the difference between these two and keeping them out of the disability threshold is something we call a health span, not lifespan. So the last 20 years of this individual's life was not spent in disability model, long-term care, relying on other individuals. This individual was, and what can we do about that? So basically, we have a program here called the Community Fitness Program, okay? And at the Community Fitness Program, we have members from the community that come in and work with our students, okay? So about 100 community members. The average age is about 63 to 64 years old. We have 25 to 30 students taking community fitness as a class. They get 3 clients each, right? They come in Monday, Wednesday, Friday. It's early, 5:30 in the morning to 7:30 in the morning for 12 weeks during the semester. So directly hands-on with the community members, working with them. And what they get is pre and post physiological testing for basically any and everything we can possibly poke and prod them for, right? So all of our students actually get this experience here. Just an example of a little workout idea that we might do, have them do circuits. We can see we actually have individuals doing speed, power, balance, and agility, and it's at your own pace, right? Walking over hurdles, you don't always have to run over hurdles. If you can run, run. If you can't, no big deal. We've certainly done research in our community fitness program as our members act as great guinea pigs for our research projects. You can see that we've had older individuals go through plyometric and power, speed, ability training, and and it's actually helped their balance as well. We've done traditional resistance training versus TRX, or like suspension trainers. Those happen to work just as well. We've transitioned people from being metabolically unhealthy obese individuals to metabolically healthy obese individuals, and we're talking about different blood markers. And we've also looked at the overall prevalence of something called dysmobility syndrome in our program, and we've actually seen that if you are involved in a community fitness program, specifically ours, you have a much less likelihood to have something like the dysmobility syndrome, as we see. Just a little snippets of our publications here.
So Nick, I'm just going to interject.
What we're trying,
just to interject, yeah. Nick, we're running a little bit out of time, so just wanted to prod you a little bit.
And I'm absolutely, I'm just wrapping up. Thank you for that. So we can see there are lots of benefits for a resistance training program, and basically being involved with something either here or at UW La Crosse, or basically just to spark an idea of maybe starting your own program to get people involved through the community. And this is just a nice little quote that I like to end on, kind of my final thought from Dr. Walter Bortz, one of the world's leading researchers on aging. He says, "Meanwhile, I continue to run slowly, but certainly. Exercise for the young is an option, but exercise for the old is an imperative." So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Nick, for that. We really appreciate it. It was a good balance of the presentations. And lastly, we are going to hear from Randy, who is our farmer voice on today. So Randy, you are on the line, aren't you?
I am. Well, thank you very much, Megan.
Perfect. And we're going to do a quick introduction for Randy as well. So I'm going to pull that up and let Jeff announce who you are, and we'll run into your talk.
Randy, I won't take very much time. I just really want to just say thanks, and then basically you're the rational voice among all these academic, ivory tower people. You're here to keep us grounded and make sure that we're doing the right thing. So Randy is is a dairy producer in Wisconsin. His wife is a physical therapist, so he understands many of these concepts anyways. And he's got 2 grown children that work on the farm, and I don't want to take any more of your time, Randy, so I'm going to turn it right over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jeff. Being the farmer here, I feel like I should have that June Dairy Month sign behind me that Jeff Smith has got. But I do have my glass here that I don't know if you'll be able to see it. It says proudly Wisconsin cheese on it with some water in it here. So, and I am one of the fortunate ones here, being out in the rural. I do have fiber optic internet, so there's no problem. I just don't have any slides to share, so I'm not screen sharing. But, you guys have covered an awful lot of things and kind of given me some ideas of what maybe I should add and delete from what I was originally thinking about saying. But I have done, my wife and I, and we've done a lot of exercise and running over the years and some weightlifting and stuff, because just what I naturally do on the farm is not necessarily a good workout in every day. If I get into a day where I'm throwing hay bales all day, it's a great workout. But otherwise, you're just doing repetitive things, walking around at a calculated slow pace, and sometimes some more strenuous physical activity and weight training is a good thing. Megan and I talked this morning and a little bit. Some of the ways that aging has affected my farm, I would say, is sometimes you need to do more with less. You need to do more to be more productive and remain profitable in today's world. But as you get older, that just doesn't mean you can automatically work harder and do things the hard way to get there. So you have to be smarter, you have to use technology, have to ask for help when you need help, so you're not out there, not being smart and getting injured, lifting things, moving things around. So yes, there are physical challenges, but use your experience to do things easier. You know, their healthcare has been talked about by some of the providers, and I know that you know, I serve on my dairy co-op's board. I also served a term on the National Dairy Board, and talking with farmers around the country, that certainly is a concern where people have to go long distances to see a doctor, to get health care, to you know, reach a hospital. Once again, fortunately, you know, living 20 minutes from Eau Claire here, I have Mayo and HSHS and Marshfield Clinic all in my backyard. So those things are not an issue for me, but they certainly are, I think, for the rural farming community. And then farmers tend to, I couldn't agree more with what was said earlier about just, you know, being healthy and means being able to work, but certainly there's more to it than just being able to work, because a lot of times farmers will take that tough person approach and just say, well, I can tough my way through this, but that is not necessarily the answer. Sometimes you do need some health care and some screening and some testing to make sure things are okay. You know, I would say that ways that I have changed on my farm is we use definitely much more technology now with, you know, whether it's cell phones, GPS guidance, yield mapping, variable rate seeding, just a lot of things to help make things easier, but yet put less effort into doing it. So, you know, those are just kind of some of my perspectives, I guess, on aging on the farm. My son wants to farm. He's 20. I would more than welcome him to do so. A little bit down the road, he helps out a lot here now, but he is currently practicing as an electrician, as we told him that he had to do something else for 5 years after high school before he could join the operation here. But I can certainly see the difference. When I graduated from high school in 1982, my father was just a couple months short of 65. So there was like a generational gap between us, and things that he told me about, well, you need to be smarter in how you do things and take care of your body, because when you get to be my age, you won't be doing it that way. And, you know, being 56 now, I can see some of those things. And, you know, the next generation down, my 20-year-old son kind of looks at me like, well, why don't you just go do that? And I'm like, you gotta think here. That's the thing you can go do if you want to do it that way. Otherwise, we're going to use some experience here. So with that, I guess I don't have anything else to add, but I probably have some good answers to questions if somebody has a specific question.
Great. Thank you, Randy. We're really glad to have your perspective on here. And I would echo what Jeff said and, you know, our conversation earlier. So now that we have heard from each of our panelists, we're going to roll into the Q&A portion. And the only disclaimer I am going to share is that we did have to say goodbye to Dr. Joe Gaugler. So any questions targeted towards him, we can always connect after the fact. So just a heads up, and you can send any questions into the chat box here. So it looks like we have one so far, and I will just go ahead and read that. It looks like it's targeted at you, Randy. So from Jennifer, we've got, what would a serious health scare or fall or injury mean for your farm's security?
Well, you know, having just, you know, 35, 40 cows here and a smaller farm, I do not have a a bank of employees on the farm here. So if I was to, you know, get into a bad situation or do something foolish or whatever, and then get injured and land in the hospital or land in a recovery, I can't sit here on my smartphone or, you know, just direct other people to do it, because I'm still the small farm guy where I'm doing 90% of the work myself. So, you know, some serious thing that had a 6-month recovery would probably be very detrimental to my farm, as there'd be some tough decisions that would have to be made. So therefore, I really try to think ahead before I do things, and I would have to knock on wood that I really haven't gotten myself into a situation, you know, that's left me hanging like that so far in my lifetime. There has been a few. Ooh, that was a close call, but you know, Lisa mentioned some of the close call things, you know, with her uncles, Peter and Otis there, and I knew them as well, or probably better than she did, because I knew them before she was around this area even, and I can think of many serious things that happen on farms and things that they were talking about, and I'm fortunate I haven't been in one of those situations.
Thank you for that response.
Question?
I think so. So we've got 2 more questions, and I think that's about all we'll have. So this next one would be great to hear from, I think, all 3 of you, but especially Lisa and Nick. This comes from Lacey. How do you communicate with farmers about the importance of exercise? Some feel that the work they do day to day is enough.
This is Lisa, and yes, that is very true, that many feel the work they do day to day is enough. The students that I work with have had various educational pieces that they've put together for farmers. So for example, we see particularly in farm workers, there's a lot of upper extremity, like shoulder pain, wrist pain, those kind of things. So we've done a lot with exercise bands. So bringing those along and actually having group situations where we can show them how to do it. Other types of resistance training, we've worked with lifting, proper lifting. So just kind of, I think, having examples to show them, as well as things that they can use that have very little, doesn't take a lot of resources on the farm. That's worked for us.
Thank you, Lisa. Anything to add, Nick?
Yeah, so just the 2 kind of community outreach programs I've been involved with, it's really been word of mouth. And a lot of the people really down at UW La Crosse and their LEHP program, a lot of them were current or retired farmers. So it is one thing to have that discussion and say, well, you know, I get it, because I come from that background of kind of manual labor type of stuff within my family. It's like, I understand that what you're doing all day is physically active, but what you're not doing is planned resistance training. And taking these individuals through these programs, having them work one-on-one with students as a part of an educational experience, yeah, after a couple of days, they're thinking like, oh, okay, I've never used those muscles before, right? We move in as 3-dimensional beings. So if you're doing farming, you're used to specific movements, right? But what we need to do to kind of address the whole body, because everything's connected. And if you have pain in your shoulder, it could be from lack of use in your, who knows, low back or something like that. So like Lisa was saying, having them do bands and taking them through different examples of workouts and screening them can be very powerful. But this has really inspired me to probably do a little bit more outreach, because maybe the farmers aren't looking for something like this as much as we just happen to kind of get the people who heard through word of mouth of our programs, either through UW La Crosse or through here at UW Eau Claire.
Thank you all for your responses on that one. Oh,
Hey, Megan, can I add something on that?
go ahead, Randy. Yeah.
You know what Nicholas just said, there is no question that if I think through the, you know, my farming friends and many of them, they feel like, you know, what they do on the farm is enough work, and that they don't have time to do other things to take care of themselves. But I think that your whole life as a farmer becomes a lot easier if you take care of yourself with some other things besides just doing on the farm. You'll thank yourself for it in the long run.
That's a great point. Let's do one more question. I know we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but I am keeping track of questions, and everyone's contact information will also be shared if we don't get to everything. So this is a question that was asked in a couple of different ways from Charlotte and Colleen and others, but so it's a two-part. So for Randy, are other farmers and operators open to preventive care and screening in your area? And then for the whole group, how do we influence farm families to be proactive and preventive in healthcare?
I think to answer if other farmers are open to proactive things, I think there's really a dividing line in that. Some of them come from you know, the old farming tradition where that wasn't you know, some of those things weren't necessary. It's just I farm and that's it. Then there's the other side where whether it's just growing up in a different mindset in your family, or, you know, I have a wife who's a physical therapist, or, you know, a lot of farmers nowadays, you have a spouse who works outside of the home in most cases, and some of them are often in other professional careers where sometimes as a farmer if you want to take the opportunity, you have the perspective to see a completely different side of jobs in life through what your spouse is doing. And I think a lot can be learned from that it's not just the old fashioned one way, and I'm working on the farm and that'll take care of everything. So, and I feel like there really is a dividing line for those who are open-minded to look at it in that sense versus those who are just, I farm and leave me alone in today's world.
This is Lisa. I'll just add one of the things that I think is so important is that we include education on agricultural health and safety and rural health in our professional training. So as nurses need to understand what farmers do, doctors need to understand what farmers do, physical therapists, occupational therapists. I just think that's something we can control, is making sure that that knowledge is included in our curriculums.
You know, that is such a great point, Lisa, because many people nowadays they're not just one step removed from a farm or knowing somebody who's a farmer. They can be 2 or 3 or 4 generations removed. And so therefore, the same holds true with somebody that's in the professional field like you are. They don't know the background of what's done on a farm.
Any final comments to add to that question, Nick, about connecting with farmers and the agricultural rural communities on especially those prevention-based messages?
You know, mine is kind of in the same vein as Lisa's, where, you know, we're in a nice, unique spot here in Western Wisconsin and at Eau Claire, where the students who we train a lot of them are from rural areas, and we'll train them up and we'll send them off to, you know, most of our students want to be PTs, OTs, physician's assistants, whatever. So we'll train them up and they'll go to graduate school and they'll a lot of times come back and move home. So I feel like that's one nice thing about being part of a intermediate size regional university, is we're kind of training it up to send them on their way to have those impacts on the rural communities that they're from.
Perfect. Well, thank you all. I know we did not get to all the questions, and I would welcome you all to continue these discussions in the breakout rooms and to continue to connect with these panelists after the fact. So just a quick intro on what we're going to be doing in the breakout rooms. It takes just a minute to get in there, and if you do need to take a quick break, now would be the time to do it. We'll be doing about 15 minutes in the breakout room, and your facilitators will pose questions for you all. This is a great opportunity for you to share resources if you have them. We will be aggregating all of those. And the one final thing I did want to share is, while we have been recording the presentations today so that we can share those after the fact, we won't be recording the breakout rooms. There will be note takers, but we won't be recording that portion. So I welcome everybody to have, productive discussions. And so how this works is, I've got everybody assigned into a breakout room, and I will be sending you out. You'll be in a Zoom call that looks similar to this, but with a smaller group. So I am going to go ahead and send everybody out. If you need help, you are able to put up a little flag for help, and that will come to myself and Paul. Any questions before we head out?
So Megan, just to remind folks that we wanted to provide an opportunity for kind of small group discussions, since we couldn't meet in person. And so one of the things I just want to encourage folks is to think about, we addressed a number of challenges. So you may think, well, gosh, there's not much I can add there. But if there are challenges that we didn't address, we want you to jot those down. That's actually the question one there. What are the challenges? The second one is what are resources that you're aware of in your particular area and community? And to just jot that down so we can actually create, in a sense, a library of resources. And then the third one there is, what resources are needed? What things do you think you would need in your community that needs to be done? And then the last one, if you've got time in this short amount of time, is how do we support one another or connect, or who else do we need to connect with in particular? So I'll turn it back to you, Megan, before you kick us off into our break rooms.
And the last thing I wanted to share is I reduced the number of breakout rooms. So there are going to be 8 now instead of 9, and that only matters for a couple of the note takers and facilitators. But it looks like everybody has a home, and I'm going to send you out to your rooms. And like I said, if anybody has any issues or questions in the meantime, you can put up a flag and ask for help.
And so how much time again, Megan?
We're going to have about 15 minutes. All right. And I will turn it over to Jeff Bender to give some closing remarks before we share a few items with everyone before we head out.
Again, I do want to apologize. I sat in my group, and I would have loved to have gone a lot longer, and I apologize. One is, we were thinking about this, and how do we set these forums up. Please give us a little bit of grace, since this was supposed to be done in person, and we're supposed to be able to have a little bit of dynamic interaction actually at the farm, and thinking about how do we support our farmers, their families, and our communities. First, I just want to say special thanks to our speakers. I think that they really provided a nice framework for us to think about this issue and why it's important, and that's critical. The second thing I want to do is I want to thank our staff, especially for Megan. I mean, she's actually done yeoman's work of just making sure that this could happen and we could pull us together. And so a special thanks to our UMASH crew in particular for being able to pull this off. And also for our partnership. So with Joe and the Center for Aging, they are providing some of the funding that we have that I'm going to just talk briefly about as an opportunity. And as Megan pointed out, we are hoping that this is actually the beginning of a conversation. So there'll be a couple things that we're gonna provide for you. One is, we're gonna try to summarize this up, try to provide you a little bit of executive summary, collect that information. The second is, we want this conversation to go on, and so we're actually creating some partnership grants, some small grants, to actually, if you have ideas of how we can support thinking about our aging farmers and their communities, I really want you to put those ideas into kind of a simple concept note and to send that to us. And so we're actually have a little bit of money to support some of those to really stimulate ideas and stimulate things going. And specifically, thinking about, here in Western Wisconsin and Minnesota in particular. So the idea here is to provide kind of a simple one-pager. We do have the link that we'll send you as to what that particular kind of request for partnership proposals look like. I'm not going to just go through it now, but I just encourage you to take a look at that. And so again, thanks for doing that. I probably just want to make sure I give our other lead in this matter some time. So Amy, I'm going to shut up just because I probably forgot some things, and I know that you will be able to remind me a couple of the key issues. So Amy, would you mind just kind of filling in the blanks where I've left them off?
I think you did a great job. I don't think you left too much out, but I really just want to thank everyone for being here. And I know my group, I had a really engaging discussion. And thanks just for being a part of this forum. By being here and sharing your concerns and potential resources, you're helping us be part of the solution and addressing this. And we really do welcome your partnership, as Jeff mentioned in the proposals. I had a few logistical things to add. So Jeff, are you completely done to move on to logistics, or do you want to chime in first?
Yeah, the only other thing that I had was just the questions. I know that there were a number of questions that came through. I tell you what we'll do with those is we'll try to triage them to our experts and then try to get responses back. We'll try to actually allow folks to see those questions more broadly, and so you can kind of see the type of answers. I thought a number of the questions were just excellent, and I really wish we had more time to dive into that. So that'd be the one thing that I was just going to add is that we'll try to look at those questions and try to get it back to folks. The other thing is feel free to reach out to us, and that actually gets probably a little bit to the logistics issue. If there are certain things or certain ideas that you've got or certain questions you had that we didn't have a chance to address, feel free to just let us know. All right, Amy, I'll turn it right back to you.
All right, thanks. And on that note, we have your participant information and your email address and your state and a little bit of information about you. We'd like to share just the basics to facilitate continued conversation and networking. And so we do hope to share that with this group. If you have any concerns about us sharing that, or if you simply want to change the contact information you provided, please just email us at the contact information provided. It's umash@umn.edu. Let us know if you don't want us to share your information or if you want us to share different information. And we'll also be continuing to compile resources. So if you have additional resources that you weren't able to share today in your discussion or through the chat box, please email us or add them in the feedback survey, and we'll make sure they get to everyone. So this is a friendly reminder. Please just take a moment, click on that survey link. It's pretty short. We'd really appreciate your feedback. This is our first time doing a virtual forum. Usually we like to do them in person and have those connections. There is also a wiki survey, which is really just a way for you to vote on your top health and safety concerns for aging farmers. So if you want to participate in that, we would love your input there. And one last thing, the Midwest Center for Occupational Health and Safety is providing certificates of completion for everyone who participated today. We'll send it via email. So this is for those of you who want to use this as a continuing education credit opportunity. That certificate will enable you to follow up with your respective boards for certification. Any other questions, final remarks? All right, well, thank you so much. We really appreciated your attendance today. And please don't hesitate again to email us at umash@umn.edu with any questions, concerns, or requests for information. And we look forward to working together on the partnership grants too.
Thank you, Jeff and Amy, for closing us out today. And thank you so much to all of our attendees. It was great to have you in our online community forum.